The machine was older than some of my grandchildren, a beige plastic answering machine from the early 90s, and I almost did not bother. But the little cassette was still seated inside it, and something made me carry it to an outlet and plug it in and press the worn play button. And then, my mother's house, 30 years after my mother left it, filled up with voices from the worst weeks of my life. And the third message on that tape told me that I had thrown away 30 years with my sister over something that never happened. I had to sit down on the floor of that storage unit. Because I have spent 3 decades absolutely certain of one thing, certain of it the way you are certain of your own name, and that beige machine, in about 4 minutes of crackling old recordings, took that certainty and showed me it had been wrong the entire time. My name is Ruth Avery. I am 62 years old, and I taught piano to the children of Richmond, Virginia for almost 40 years before I retired. I am going to tell you what was on that tape. But to understand why it broke me open, you have to understand the 30 years it ended, and the sister I spent all of them refusing to speak to. I had one sibling, a younger sister, Carol, 2 years behind me, and growing up, we were close in the ordinary, scrapping, devoted way of sisters. Not identical, not always easy, but bound. I would have told you at 30 that nothing on earth could put a permanent wall between Carol and me. And then our mother got sick. I was 32, Carol was 30. Our father had died years before, so it was just the two of us and our mother, and the illness that took her was not quick. It was a long, sloping, 18-month decline, the kind that asks everything of a family and then asks more. And I want to tell you, plainly and without any false modesty, what my role in those 18 months was, because it is the root of everything that went wrong. I was the one who carried it. I lived nearest to our mother, and so I was the one in the house. I was the one at the bedside in the long evenings, the one who managed the medications, the one who did not sleep, the one whose own life simply stopped for a year and a half so that our mother would not be alone. I gave those 18 months everything I had, and then I gave them more than I had. I want to be honest about what those 18 months made of me, because it matters to the rest of this. By the end of them, I was not a whole person anymore. I had stopped teaching. I had stopped sleeping a full night. My marriage was strained nearly to breaking. My own children barely saw me, and I existed almost entirely inside our mother's house, inside the rhythm of her medications and her bad nights and her smaller and smaller good days. I was running on something past exhaustion, something with no name. And a person in that state is not generous, and a person in that state is not fair, and a person in that state cannot, will not, see past the edges of her own enormous load. I tell you this not to excuse what I later did to my sister. I tell you because the woman who judged Carol so harshly was not a calm woman weighing evidence. She was a woman drowning, and drowning people do not assess. They just reach for someone to blame for the water. And my sister Carol, in those same 18 months, Carol was not there. That is the sentence the whole tragedy grew out of, so let me say it again, the way I said it to myself for 30 years. When our mother was dying, my sister was not there. Carol lived a few hours away, and Carol did not come the way I needed her to come. She visited. I will not say she never visited, but her visits were short, and they were scattered, and there were long stretches, brutal stretches, when I did not see her at all. I would be at our mother's bedside at 2 a.m, alone, exhausted past the point of tears, and I would think about my sister asleep in her own house hours away, living her own undisturbed life, and a thing would harden in me a little more. Where was she? Where was Carol? I was breaking myself in half, and my sister was somewhere else, and I could not understand it, and I could not forgive it. There was one night in particular that became, for me, the centerpiece of my case against Carol. I returned to it for 30 years the way you press a bruise. Our mother had a frightening night, a real crisis, and I was alone with it. Alone in that house at 3 a.m, trying to decide whether to call an ambulance, terrified and completely by myself. And the next day, shaking, I called Carol, and Carol did not pick up, and it went to her machine. To me, in that moment, that unanswered phone was everything. It was the whole indictment. My mother nearly died in the night, and my sister did not even answer the telephone. I built a monument to that night. I did not know, could not have known, because I never asked, that Carol had not answered because Carol had been, at that exact hour, in a hospital billing office 2 hours away the moment it opened, fighting to keep our mother's coverage from lapsing. We were both, that morning, fighting for the same woman's life. I just decided that only my fight was real. Our mother died on a gray morning in the spring, and it was in the days right after. The funeral, the arrangements, the terrible administrative aftermath of a death, that the wall went up between Carol and me, and it went up for good. I do not even remember the exact words anymore, which tells you something about how these things actually work. There was a conversation, a few days after the funeral, both of us shattered and unslept and raw, and it went wrong. I know that I accused her. I know that I said, in essence, "Where were you? I did this alone. You abandoned our mother and you abandoned me." And I know that Carol said something back, something sharp, something defensive, and that I heard, in whatever she said, only confirmation, only proof of what I had already decided, that my sister was selfish, that she had run from the hardest thing our family ever faced, and that she had left her older sister to carry a dying woman alone. We both said unforgivable things in that kitchen. And then Carol drove home, and we did not speak again for 30 years. I have tried this past year to remember that kitchen honestly, and the honest memory is not flattering to me. I remember that Carol, when I accused her, did not simply attack back. I remember now that she first tried, for a moment, to tell me something. She started to say something about the phone calls, about everything she had been handling, and her voice was rising and cracking as she said it. And I remember that I did not let her finish. I remember thinking, with a kind of cold fury, that she was making excuses, that she was trying to wriggle out of her absence with a story about paperwork, and that I would not give her the satisfaction of being heard. I talked over my own sister while she was trying to hand me the truth. The truth was in that kitchen 30 years ago. Carol brought it. I refused to receive it, and then I spent 3 decades not knowing I had refused it. That is the part that is hardest to forgive myself for. Not that I did not know, but that I was told and would not listen. 30 years. I want you to feel the length of that, because I did not. Not really, not while it was happening. It does not feel like 30 years while you are living it. It feels like one cold decision, and then just the ordinary passage of time on the far side of it. We did not have a dramatic estrangement. There were no further fights because there was no further contact to fight in. And that, I have come to believe, is how most long estrangements actually survive. Not on fresh anger, which would at least keep the wound visible, but on simple silence and the slow, numbing passage of time. An estrangement does not need to be fed, it only needs to be left alone. Year after year, the not speaking became less a decision and more a fact, like the color of a wall you stopped noticing. Carol simply became a person I did not speak to. We missed each other's children growing up. We missed each other's whole middle age. Twice, over the decades, Carol tried. A letter once, a phone message another time. Tentative, reaching. And both times I did not answer, because I was the wronged one, and answering would have felt like absolving her, and I was not prepared to absolve a sister who had abandoned our dying mother. I have the letter still. I found it this past year, in a drawer, and I made myself read it. The letter from my own sister that I had received and never answered, sometime in the 2nd decade of our silence. It was not an angry letter. It was not even really a letter asking for anything. It was just Carol, telling me a little about her life, and saying, near the end, that she thought about me, and that the door was open if I ever wanted to walk back through it. I had held that open door in my hands years ago, and I had put it in a drawer. Reading it now, knowing what I know, I understood that the truth had reached for me more than once, by more than one road, and that each time I had been the one who turned it away. So the silence held. I built my entire understanding of my family around a simple, settled fact. I had a sister who failed us when it mattered most, and I had been right to let her go. Our mother's house was sold long ago, but her things were not all gone through. There were boxes boxes I had taken into storage 30 years ago and quite simply never been able to open. Grief had sealed them as surely as any tape. And this past winter, at 62, with my own life quieter and my own end no longer an abstraction, I finally decided it was time. I rented a morning and I drove to that storage unit, and I started, at last, to open my mother's boxes. Most of it was what you would expect: linens, dishes, the soft archaeology of a life. And then, in a box near the back, wrapped in a towel, I found our mother's old answering machine, the one that had sat on the table in her hallway, and the cassette tape was still inside it. I sat there holding it, and I understood what it was. It was the tape that had been in the machine in her final months, the messages no one had ever cleared, because the people who would have cleared it were too busy that year, either dying or breaking. 30 years of dust on a recording of our family's worst season. And I plugged the machine in, and I pressed play. I should tell you why I had never opened those boxes, because it is part of the lesson. It was not laziness, and it was not really even busyness. It was that the boxes were a sealed door, and on the other side of that door was the worst year of my life, and I had decided, at 32, that I never wanted to walk back through it. For 30 years, I told myself I was protecting myself by leaving them shut. I see now that I was doing the opposite. I had locked the truth about my sister inside those boxes along with the grief, and by refusing to face the grief, I had also refused, for 3 decades, every chance to find the truth. The thing I was avoiding and the thing that could have healed me were in the same cardboard box, and I had treated the whole box as something to flee. That is worth saying plainly. Sometimes the door you cannot bear to open is the exact door your peace is waiting behind. I almost died never opening mine. I was 62 before I found the courage, and I came that close to being 80, or gone, before I knew the truth about my own sister. The first messages were small and ordinary and almost unbearable. A neighbor, a pharmacy, my own younger voice leaving my mother a note about a doctor's appointment. I sat on the cold floor and listened to the lost, ordinary sound of that terrible year. And then came the third message. And the third message was my sister Carol's voice. It was Carol, 30 years younger, and she was leaving our mother a message. Except our mother by then was too ill to come to the phone, so really Carol was leaving it for whoever picked the messages up. And in it, Carol's voice, tired and stretched thin, said that she had spent the whole day on the phone with the insurance company again, that she thought she had finally gotten the second round of treatment approved, that she had also called the medical supply company and the hospital billing office, and that she would drive down on the weekend with the paperwork, so that she said my name, she said, so that Ruth would not have to deal with any of it. And then, at the end, her voice cracked, and she said she was sorry she could not be there more, that the calls and the fighting with the companies were taking everything she had, and that she hoped Mom knew she was doing everything she could from where she was. I want you to understand what that message did to me, physically, sitting on that floor. It was not only the information in it, though the information was an earthquake. It was the sound of her. It was the exhaustion in my 30-year younger sister's voice. For 3 decades, I had carried a single fixed image of Carol during our mother's illness, a rested, comfortable, undisturbed woman, living her ordinary life, choosing not to be bothered. And the voice on that tape annihilated that image in 4 sentences. The Carol on the tape was not rested. The Carol on the tape sounded exactly the way I had sounded that year, hollowed out, stretched past the end of herself, running on fumes. She sounded like my twin in suffering. We had been, the entire time, the same exhausted, frightened, overextended woman, working ourselves to nothing for the same mother, and I had spent 30 years certain that one of us was suffering and the other was asleep. I stopped the tape, and I sat on that floor in that storage unit, 62 years old, and I could not breathe, because the floor of 30 years had just dropped out from under me, and I pressed play again. And the tape kept going, and it kept telling me the same thing, message after message, in my sister's exhausted voice across those 18 months. Here is what the tape told me. Here is what my sister Carol had actually been doing in all those weeks when she was not there. Our mother's dying did not consist only of the bedside. I knew the bedside. I lived at the bedside. But a long terminal illness in this country has a second, invisible front, and that front is a vast, grinding war of paperwork and phone calls and insurance denials and billing departments and supply companies and approvals and appeals. It is a brutal, full-time, soul-destroying job all by itself. And Carol, who I had spent 30 years calling the sister who ran away, Carol had been fighting that entire second war, alone, from a few hours away, for 18 months. The reason she had not been at the bedside as often as I needed was not that she was asleep in her undisturbed life. It was that she was on the phone for 6 and 8 hours a day, every day, with insurance companies, clawing our mother's treatment out of a system designed to refuse it. She had taken the half of the burden that was invisible, and because it was invisible, because it happened on a telephone hours away and not in the room where I could see it, I had looked at the space where my sister should have been and concluded that the space was empty. It was never empty. I just could not see what was filling it. And there were more messages scattered through the tape, and together they built the full picture. There was one where Carol mentioned she had driven 4 hours round trip to deliver documents in person because the company would not accept fax. There was one where she sounded like she had been crying, saying a claim had been denied again and she did not know how many more times she could call them without breaking. There was one, near the end of the tape, where she simply said she loved Mom and that she was sorry she could not make the room stop being so far away. Message after message of a woman fighting a brutal, invisible, unwinnable feeling war, alone, and apologizing. Apologizing, on our mother's answering machine, for not being able to also be in 2 places at once. I had spent 30 years wanting an apology from Carol for abandoning us. The tape was full of Carol's apologies. They had been sitting in a beige box in a storage unit the whole time, and the only thing she had ever needed to apologize for was a limitation of physics, and I had turned it into a crime and sentenced her to 30 years. I want to tell you what those messages did to my memory of that year, because it was like watching my own past be relit. Every grievance I had carried for 30 years turned itself over. I had a hard, hoarded memory of a specific terrible week when our mother nearly did not get a treatment, and I had blamed Carol's absence for the chaos of it. The tape told me that that was the week Carol won the appeal that made the treatment happen at all. She had been absent from the room because she was absent into a telephone, saving the very thing I was panicking about. I remembered resenting that Carol never helped with the money. The tape was a record of Carol managing all of the money, every denied claim, every bill, so that I would never have to. I had spent 30 years certain that I had carried our mother alone. I had not carried her alone. I had carried one half of her, the visible half, the half with a face and a bedside, and my sister had carried the other half, the half made of phone calls and forms, and had done it silently, and had then driven home to her own house, where I could not see her working, and I had watched her taillights and called her a deserter. The hardest memory to relight was the funeral itself. I had carried, for 30 years, a bitter image of Carol at our mother's funeral, distracted, I had thought, distant, somewhere else even on that day, taking phone calls, stepping out. I had filed it as proof of her coldness, proof that even at the very end she could not be fully present for our family. I understand now what I was actually looking at. Carol was stepping out, on the day of the funeral, because the administrative war does not stop for a funeral, because there were final accounts and final claims and final calls, and she was still, even then, even on that gray morning, shielding me from all of it, taking the ugly, necessary phone calls out into the parking lot so that I could simply stand at our mother's graveside and grieve. I had watched my sister protect me on the worst day of our lives, and I had recorded it in my memory as her failing to care. There is no detail of that year that I got right. Not one. I want to be honest about the shame, because the shame was the worst of it, and there is no telling this story truthfully without it. There was no one else to be angry at. That is the thing. In so many stories like this, there is a villain, a liar, a manipulator, someone who engineered the misunderstanding. There was no villain in mine. There was just me. I had not been lied to. I had simply, in the worst and most exhausting season of my life, failed to imagine that my sister's burden might be real, even though I could not see it. And then, I had taken that failure of imagination, and I had built a 30-year wall out of it. And every year Carol reached over that wall, I had slapped her hand down, because I was so certain, so righteous, so sure I was the one who had been wronged. The tape did not just tell me Carol was innocent, it told me that I was the one who had done the abandoning. For 30 years, I had a sister reaching for me, and I had a stack of evidence that she was good, and I had refused to look at any of it because being the wronged sister had become part of who I was. That last part is the one I have had to sit with longest. Being the wronged sister had become part of who I was. Over 30 years, my grievance against Carol stopped being something I felt and became something I was built out of. It was in how I told the story of our family. It was in the sympathy I quietly accepted from others, the good sister, the one who stayed, the one who was abandoned. It gave me a settled place to stand. And a settled place to stand, even a bitter one, is a thing the human heart does not give up easily. I think that is the real reason I never answered Carol's letter, never returned her call. It was not only pride. It was that answering would have meant giving up the identity I had built on the rubble of that year. To forgive Carol, I would have had to stop being the wronged one, and after 30 years, I no longer knew who I would be instead. The tape did not just inform me, it evicted me from a self I had lived inside for 3 decades. That is disorienting, and it is painful, and I would not trade it for anything, because the self I had built was a self with no sister in it. But I did not let the shame be the end of it. Shame that just sits there and rots a person is its own kind of waste, and I had wasted enough. I took that beige machine in the tape, and I went home, and I found in an old address book a phone number for my sister, and I did not know if it would still work. And I called it. Carol answered. An old woman's voice now, the way mine is an old woman's voice now. 30 years will do that. We'll take the 2 young women from that kitchen and quietly replace them. There was a long, terrible silence when she realized who was calling, and I did not perform a speech. I just said, "Carol, I found Mom's old answering machine. I played the tape. I heard your messages. I heard about the insurance and the appeals and all of it." And I said, "I have been so wrong for so long, and I am so sorry." And my sister, on the other end of the line, after 30 years, began to cry. And then, through it, she said something I did not expect, something that has reshaped this whole story for me. Before she said it, though, there was the silence. The long one, after she understood who was calling, and before either of us could speak. And I want to tell you what I did in that silence, because it was the hardest thing I have done in many years. I stayed on the line. Every instinct in me, 30 years of instinct, was telling me to fill the silence with explanation, or to soften it, or to retreat from it. And underneath all of that, a cowardly voice was telling me to simply hang up, that 30 years was too far, that I had no right. And I made myself stay, and stay quiet, and let my sister have all the time she needed on the other end of that line. Because I understood that I was not owed a quick forgiveness, and that the least I could do, after 30 years of refusing to listen to her, was to finally, for once, simply hold the phone and wait, for as long as it took, for my sister to be ready to speak. Carol said that she had spent 30 years carrying her own version of our rupture, and that her version was the mirror of mine. Because from where Carol had stood, she had spent 18 months waging an exhausting, invisible, thankless war for our mother's care, every day until she had nothing left, and her older sister had never once acknowledged it, had never thanked her, had seemed not even to know she was doing it. And then, in that kitchen after the funeral, that same sister had called her a deserter to her face. Carol had driven home from that kitchen, believing that I had erased everything she had done, that I had decided only the bedside counted and her months of fighting were worth nothing, and that I would rather have a sister to blame than a sister who had helped in a way I could not see. She had reached over the wall twice, she said, and when I did not answer, she had finally concluded that I simply did not want her, and she had stopped. We had each spent 30 years as the wronged one. We had each been nursing a grievance built, brick by brick, out of the other one's pain. Two sisters, drowning side by side in the same loss, each one too far under to see that the other was drowning too. Carol told me something else on that first phone call, and it has stayed with me as much as anything. She said that for the first few years of the silence, she had been angry, truly angry, the way I had been, but that somewhere around the 10th year, the anger had worn out, and what was left underneath it was just grief and confusion and a question she could never answer. The question was simply, how? How had her sister, who knew her, who had grown up beside her, been able to believe she would abandon their dying mother? Carol said that not being believed by me had wounded her more deeply than the estrangement itself, that she could have survived a fight, but that she could not understand being so completely misjudged by the one person who should have known her best. And hearing that, I had to face a hard thing. My misjudgment had not only cost us 30 years, it had told my sister, for 30 years, a lie about how little I must have thought of her. She had spent 3 decades believing that I considered her capable of the worst thing a daughter could do. That, more than the lost time, is what I have had to ask her to forgive. Carol and I have spent this past year finding our way back to each other, and I want to be honest about what that looks like, because it is not a fairy tale, and the fairy tale version would dishonor the real one. We cannot get the 30 years back. That has to be said plainly. I do not know my sister's children, not really, and she does not know mine, and there is no version of the time we have left that repairs that. We are 2 old women now, and we became old apart, and we have to grieve that even as we are reunited. The grief and the reunion arrive in the same hand. But we have also found something I did not expect, which is that the bond underneath the 30 years did not die. It was only buried. When Carol and I talk now, and we talk often every few days, we are, somewhere under the old voices, still the 2 scrapping, devoted girls who once could not imagine a wall between them. The wall is down. It came down 30 years too late, and it still came down, and I have learned that 30 years too late is a world away from never. There is a particular kind of conversation Carol and I have found ourselves having, this past year, that I did not expect and have come to treasure. We talk about our mother. Really talk about her last year, her decline, her death, which is something neither of us has been able to do with anyone for 30 years. Because here is what the estrangement also stole, the loss inside the loss. When Carol and I cut each other off, we each lost the only other person on earth who had been through that specific 18 months, the only other person who could truly understand. For 30 years, we each grieved our mother alone, walled off from the one other human being who had loved and lost her the same way. Now, finally, we grieve her together. We compare memories. We fill in each other's gaps. Carol can tell me about the parts of that year I never saw, the phone call war, and I can tell her about the bedside, the parts she never saw. And between the 2 of us, for the first time in 30 years, our mother's last year is whole. We are not only reuniting with each other, we are recovering our mother, the real and complete story of her, by finally putting our 2 halves of it back together. Carol came to visit me this spring, here in Richmond, the first time my sister had been in my home in 3 decades. We did something that afternoon that I think we both needed. We sat together, and we listened to the whole tape, all the way through, the 2 of us, side by side on my couch. We listened to our mother's hallway fill with the voices of that lost year, the neighbors, the pharmacy, my young voice, Carol's young, exhausted voice fighting the insurance company. And it was not only painful, it was, strangely, a kind of homecoming. Because that tape, which I had thought was a recording of the year our family broke, turned out to be something else entirely. It was a recording of 2 daughters, on 2 different fronts, each one giving everything she had to the same dying woman. It was, all along, the proof that we had both shown up. We had just shown up in different rooms, and never gotten to see each other do it. I keep that beige answering machine on a shelf now, where I see it every day. My grandchildren think it is a funny old relic, and I let them. They do not need to know yet that it is the most important object I own, that it is the thing that, 30 years late, gave me back my only sister. They will understand it someday. For now, it just sits on the shelf, an ugly little beige box, holding the 4 minutes of truth that I refused to go looking for, and that waited 30 years for me anyway. Carol and I have made each other a promise, and it is a small one, and it is the most important promise of our late lives. We have promised that we will not do it again, that whatever comes, whatever hard season is still ahead of us, and at our age there will be hard seasons, we will not let a bad afternoon become a closed door. We have promised to assume the best of each other now, by default, the way we should have all along. If one of us goes quiet, the other one will not build a case. The other one will simply call. It sounds like such a small thing to promise, but a small thing like that, made and kept 30 years ago, would have given us back 3 decades. So we make it now, the two of us, 2 old women who learned the cost the hardest way there is, and we intend, with whatever years we have left, to keep it. I want to leave you with the 2 things this taught me. The first is about grief and what it does to our eyes. When a family goes through something catastrophic, a long illness, a death, a crisis that asks everything, every single person in that family is carrying a load, and here is the cruel part. You can usually only see your own. Grief and exhaustion shrink your vision down to the weight in your own 2 hands, and from inside that narrowed sight, it is terribly easy to look at someone who is carrying their load somewhere you cannot see, and to conclude that they are carrying nothing at all. I did that to my sister. I am asking you, if your family is in a hard season right now, to fight for the wider view, to assume, even when you cannot see it, even when you are too tired to imagine it, that the others are probably drowning too, just in a different room. No one in a grieving family is doing nothing. They may only be doing it where you cannot watch. The second thing is about the doors we slam in our worst moments, and how long we then guard them. The rupture between Carol and me was born in one kitchen, on one terrible unslept afternoon, when 2 devastated women said sharp things to each other. That happens. Grief makes people cruel for an hour. The tragedy was not the kitchen. The tragedy was the 30 years I then spent defending what was said in it, refusing my sister's letter, refusing her message, guarding the wall, because admitting I might be wrong felt harder than staying angry. So if there is a door in your life that got slammed in a bad season, by you or at you, I am asking you not to do what I did. Do not let a single terrible afternoon harden into a 30-year verdict. Check. Reach back. Open the box you have been afraid to open. The truth that could give someone back to you may be sitting quietly on the other side of a door you have simply decided never to open again. If this story landed for you, drop the word tape in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. First, in a grieving family, never mistake a burden you cannot see for a burden no one is carrying. Catastrophe narrows everyone's vision down to their own load, and the work other people do, the phone calls, the paperwork, the quiet logistics, the carrying done in another room or another city, is real even when it has no face you can watch. Before you decide a family member failed to show up, ask yourself honestly whether they simply showed up somewhere you were too overwhelmed to look. Assume the others are struggling too. In a true crisis, they almost always are. Second, do not let one terrible afternoon become a 30-year sentence. Grief and exhaustion will make good people say cruel things. That is human, and it is survivable. What is not survivable, what costs whole decades, is the pride that comes afterward, the refusal to revisit, to reach back, to check whether the verdict you reached in your worst hour was ever actually true. A slammed door is just a slammed door. It only becomes an estrangement when you decide, year after year, to guard it. Reach back while reaching back is still possible. No one grieves gracefully. I'll see you next time.